The 2022 NFL draft is coming here soon. So what should we be looking for in each of the first round? I can't do it anymore. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was throwing some shade at my co-host Adam, who's out on assignment this week, but you're stuck with me. I'm riding solo tonight. Y'all know who it is. Chris Allen at Chris Allen FFWX. And I'm here to record the Dynasty Newsletter for this week. And we're just on the eve of the NFL draft. We're just a few days away. And from a dynasty perspective, it is the big event of the year for us. I mean, we've known everything, right? I mean, we've gone through all the data, combine, pro days, sifted through all of their production throughout their collegiate histories, and we've got everything from coach speak to anonymous scouts to, I mean, it's now gotten into character concern season for some of these prospects. But let's just try and see if we can cut out all the noise, stop messing around with our rankings, and just wait until Thursday. Let's get through this weekend, and then we'll have, I mean, the round two of the debate for these prospects starts on Monday, right? After we know their landing spots, now we can start to argue about, well, one, was their draft capital justified? And then two, what is their production going to look like? Can we start to project what their careers at the NFL level are going to be? But for right now, let's focus on just getting to Thursday. Let's try and get through to Thursday without too much more drama. But we all know how that works. I mean, it's social media. It's people that have a bunch of money on the line. And of course, there's going to be some sort of bombshell, news report that's going to come out within the next couple of days. I mean, y'all know how it is like every single season, but I'm trying to make it to Thursday without getting, too crazy or at what I see on social media, but we'll see how things go. But what I wanted to do today is kind of walk through what I'm expecting to see or how I'm going to work through each of the rounds of the draft. I'm not going to go through all 6 or 7. We ain't got that kind of time. And really, what should we really care about are the first, let's say, like first couple of days, rounds 1 through 3, because we have so many players that are expected to get drafted in the first round, and most of the draft capital and how it correlates to fantasy success is typically for those the first few days. Of course, you'll find your 4th, 5th round gems, Elijah Mitchell, so on and so forth. But the majority of those guys, first couple of days. So I'm going to stick to the first 3 rounds of the upcoming NFL draft. And I'm going to try and break it down like this. 1, what do we know? Like, what have all the mocks told us? What is the data telling us? And what can we expect from each of the teams, like for the first? And then also, how can we adjust to that information? Like if we are expecting to see 6 or 7 wide receivers getting drafted in the first round, well, how can we adjust to that? I mean, are we going to go with the guy that we want? I mean, everybody's got their favorite prospect from Drake London to Sky Moore, who could possibly get drafted in the top 32 of the NFL draft starting on Thursday. Or do we wind up just saying, well, draft capital rules all? That's how some folks have historically gone about doing it, and that's the way we need to approach it. So at least we'll start there. What we know, what we can expect, and how we can adjust to it. All right, so let's go ahead and see what we can do with that information here at the Dynasty Newsletter here on footballguys.com. Football Guys on YouTube, go ahead and check that out. I mean, my analysis along with Adam's analysis. We've got the Dynasty Show as well that will provide their takes actually within the next couple of days. I mean, right before the NFL draft. And of course, I mean, our Dynasty director, Jeff Bell, I'm sure they're cooking up some content for you guys this weekend to have some live reactions or just some quick turn reactions to anything that you're going to see over the next 4 to 5 days. So be sure to stay tuned to all of that and more. I mean, from the OGs, Sig Bloom, Cecil Lammy, Matt Waldman. Of course, we're going to have all that type of content here for you. So, I mean, definitely stay tuned and stay locked to YouTube and also footballguys.com. But let's go ahead and hop on into the first round. And let's start with, of course, like what do we know as of right now? And I mean, you guys know me. You guys know that I like my data. I like to be able to take a look at like who's going to show up or like what can our expectations be. And of course, like one of the websites that I typically like to use is Grinding the Mocks. I mean, if you guys have been over there, you can see that you can kind of set up how many types of prospects you want to take a look at, and it spits out how many we can expect to see drafted in the top 32. And as of right now, 8 to 10, somewhere in there, we can expect to see drafted in the first round starting on Thursday night. And that's to be expected. I mean, that's kind of what we know, right? We don't know specifically where. I mean, we've seen everything from, Atlanta taking a quarterback. Anybody else, like any of the wide receivers that might get drafted. If you take a look at it, how many wide receivers looking at? Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 minimum, or 5 to 6 minimum being drafted. That's not even counting as of right now. I don't see Sky Moore's name on here. He's down at 15, but with the rumors of Sky Moore also sneaking into the first round, we've got possibly, at minimum 5, possibly 6, 7 wide receivers going. And that is going to be my focus, or what I'm looking for, like in the first round. Like, we know that it's possible that a quarterback like Malik Willis, with his upside, despite the warts that he possibly has, like with the amount of pressure that he's taken and his inability to adjust to pressure as of right now, it's possible that the Seahawks could wind up taking him, or I've seen, not whether or not I believe it, but Atlanta could possibly take him. Pittsburgh could possibly they're in the market for a quarterback. There are teams that could be useful or make good use of their first round draft capital by picking up a Malik Willis. But with so many wide receivers on the board and possibly being drafted there, that is what I'm looking for. And if you take a look at kind of how the first round plays out, this is just data that I pulled from, I think it was Tankathon, if I'm remembering correctly, but I'm trying to, at least in my mind, map out the first round and look at the first round as a set of inflection points, because you've got Carolina kind of playing the wild card at 6 overall. They're more looking at a quarterback at this point than anything else. But then the wide receivers, similar with Atlanta and Seattle, but around like 8, 9, 10, that's where we're kind of looking at that first inflection point, like in the draft, where a quarterback could be taken there, but at the very least, we're expecting a wide receiver or 2 being selected around the 8 to 10 range. And then, of course, we go through 11 through 15, not really expecting much, 11 through 14, but then around where Philadelphia, New Orleans, and the Chargers at 17th overall, that then things start to pick back up. More wide receivers possibly getting drafted there, especially with New Orleans trading back in or making their trade with Philadelphia in order to get back or have a get their extra first round pick as well. There's some possibility there at 18, 19, we can see some sparks fly. And then again, once we get to pick 20, pick 22, so in the just past the halfway point in the first round. And then of course, as you can see, as I put it there on the chart, and once we get to Dallas and on down throughout the rest of the draft, pretty much up until you get to my Bengals at 31, just chaos, absolute chaos. From Green Bay and their need at wide receiver with the Devontae Adams trade, Kansas City with them moving on from Tyreek. Buffalo could possibly take a wide receiver. There are a number of ways that the back end of the draft can go out. And so that's essentially kind of how we're adjusting or how we're looking at the first round, even from a dynasty perspective. But my thing here is, and this is something that Adam and I have discussed this maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's a question I'm still trying to hash out. And what I pose to other drafters, other dynasty managers, let's say it's Jameson Williams, or let's say Garrett Wilson, or whomever the case may be. You could pull up our rankings here over at Footballguys, and you can see that we've got, from Mr. Heasley to Jeff Bell to Adam Wilde, ranking a number of these prospects coming in. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6? Even with Sky Moore, like I mentioned earlier, but at least 5 to 6 wide receivers comfortably within the top 10 of our ranks right now. But let's say a guy like Drake London, he's the one that gets the highest draft capital. It's the Jets that wind up selecting him at 10th overall. So he gets the highest draft capital. And then a guy like, let's say, Jameson Williams, he falls all the way to 31st overall, or not 31st overall, but he winds up going to the Chiefs or something like that. So 30th overall, 29th. Where does the shift in how we view those draft picks start to change? Because some folks have gone with the 80 or not ADP, but draft capital kind of gives us that NFL teams are starting to value those players more. So we should in turn value those players more. But with so many wide receivers going on, my adjustment to at least that adage is I'm going to look at essentially where the landing spot to me is going to dictate how we should value these guys. Because if we've got at least 5 going in the first round, draft capital isn't playing as big of a factor in my evaluation, at least as much as it has been in years past, because there's no way that you can equate the Jets situation to any of the other guys that are going to be drafted here in the back end of the first round. You mean to tell me that, I don't know, anybody from like if Chris Olave goes to like the Buffalo Bills, it doesn't matter who the Jets selected at 10th overall, just because, again, looking at the path to production, the quality of passer that they're going to be connected to, so on and so forth. I mean, you guys see what I'm saying here? So draft capital at this point and the adjustment to that is now going to play such a large role in how we evaluate these first round wide receivers. And that's what I'm going to be looking for in how the market now starts to dictate how we should value those guys. Whereas, I mean, if we're all saying that each of these guys were going to be first round talent, now it's going to be the differentiating factor for this is absolutely going to be not just the draft capital assigned to them, but just the landing spot. That's going to be the big thing that I'm going to be looking for. But outside of that, if you're looking for something different, if you want something different out of footballguys.com, our own Joe Bryant was able to, he wants to know, what you're looking for, in content, from FBG. If you sign up for the daily newsletter that he puts out, he does have a survey that's available for you to kind of take a look at. I mean, what are you looking for? What have you liked in the past? What do you dislike about the content that we're putting out here at FBG? And then what we can do better to kind of serve y'all. And so if you sign up, head on over to footballguys.com. Free email update up here at the top. And then in the newsletter, he's providing you a way to kind of give us some feedback. Of course, we try and check the comments here on the YouTube videos. And of course, I mean, the comments that we get on social media as well kind of help drive us. But Joe's going directly to y'all. He wants to know what your thoughts are. So if you can, of course, subscribe, drop a comment, kind of guide us there. But also if you want to, sign up for that daily newsletter, sign up for that, put in your information and provide us with, I guess, a little bit of feedback. But all right, moving on. Second round. So again, what do we know? What can we expect and how to adjust to it? Second round, it gets a little chaotic. As of right now, what do we know in terms of what can we expect for at least the prospects that are going to get drafted? So pop on over to Grinding the Mocks. Let's go and see what we can expect here. So it always disconnects me every now and again, if you don't touch something for a little bit. So we can move past the first round, get into the second round. So all of these guys passed here. So we've got a George Pickens, a Sam Howell, Breece Hall, and Sky Moore again, like we discussed earlier. But how many more of these guys are we really expecting to be drafted here? There's a lot more depth at the position now, or depth at the skill positions now, because now we're getting access to not just the wide receivers. We talked about 5 to 7 getting drafted in the first round, but now the running backs are starting to come into play. As you just saw, Breece Hall, his name getting brought up on the getting brought up on the screen. Who else is going to be up there? Kenneth Walker also discussed being brought up there. Even some of the tight ends. That's more towards the back end of the second round, or actually take that back. That's on Trey McBride actually at 57th overall. So wide receivers, running backs, quarterbacks, and tight ends, we're getting the full breadth of the skill positions there. And so looking at what we can expect from a draft position standpoint, we can look at what's going on in the second round. Where are those inflection points? Which teams are we expecting to now start to buy into that? Well, most of it's coming in the early rounds. A couple of picks from Seattle, Chicago might get into the mix. Houston has been mocked to grabbing a couple of players, Washington as well. But most of the action in the second round is getting front loaded in those first, in the top 50 picks, top 50 picks overall. I think that's where, again, in my mind, early second round draft capital, especially for a number of these wide receivers, and then definitely for the running backs as well. Again, if you're looking back at from a historical standpoint, what are our expectations from these prospects? That's still solid draft capital for for each of the skill positions. I mean, just outside of tight end, unless we're expecting otherworldly talent, or otherworldly production from the tight end position, which we don't have a Kyle Pitts in this draft. I mean, wide receivers, running backs, and quarterbacks still do have a decent hit rate here in this particular area. So, I mean, what can we, again, how are we now adjusting to this information? What can we do in order to kind of take a look and see, how can we adjust to this news? Well, which teams can we reliably expect to wind up picking up any of the guys that are expected to go in the second round, or on day 2, or at least early day 2? Now, we haven't discussed Breece Hall yet. He's one of the guys that got brought up. He's been mocked to a number of different teams. I've seen everywhere from the Texans, to possibly to the Cardinals, a couple other possible places that he can land. But I mean, the teams have already kind of given us information as well. Another spot that you can take a look at from a data perspective, WalterFootball.com, they track each of the players that they've brought in for visits. And they've even categorized that by, I mean, if it's just a visit, they saw him on their pro day, or they brought him in for a private workout or whatever. And so I took a look at which teams have kind of done the same thing for private workouts. So actually used their official 30 visits on them, so on and so forth. And at least for Arizona, it is kind of interesting that they wound up using at least 3 of their 30 visits, and then 4 of their private workouts, and 3 of their private workouts on running backs, 4 of their private workouts on wide receivers. 0 on quarterback. Looks like they're pretty much set. Maybe this Kyler Murray thing might just be complete smoke. Who knows? Fingers crossed for those folks that have Kyler Murray on their dynasty rosters. But it is interesting that a team that doesn't have a first-round pick, I mean, is still in the skill position market. So if we do think that a guy like Breece Hall is going to wind up going to the Cardinals, while he wasn't one of the guys that was brought in for a visit, it does look like Arizona is at least indicating that is a position of need for them. And the same thing for wide receivers. I mean, we saw earlier on there, and I'll pull it up again. I mean, the wide receivers that they took a look at, I mean, at least one of these guys, 2 of these guys rather, I mean, Treylon Burks, Jamison Williams, have been getting quite a bit of buzz throughout the entire draft process. That it is interesting that, I mean, those are the guys that they've been looking at, and at least Treylon Burks should be available in the, let's say, early day 2 area. But I mean, of course, with where they've been drafting at, not until 55th overall, I'd be surprised if Burks fell that far. But if he is one of the guys that they're interested in drafting, they might have to work a little, I don't know, trade magic in order to make that happen. But each of these teams now that is going to want to try and draft any of those guys, let's say, even if we want to take a look at Seattle, I mean, who has Seattle been drafting or taking a look at? I mean, more of the guys Christian Watson, we saw his name pop up earlier on Grinding the Mock. So one of the guys that is expected to go possibly in the first round, but if not, day 2 draft capital, and was brought in for a private workout as well. So this is the type of information that you can take a look at to better understand where are these teams possibly heading. And then the adjustment to that, especially if we're looking at these guys going around here, where we're expecting a lot of the action to happen. And then also then taking a look at where we're looking at each of the teams and how they've kind of identified or allocated their private workouts. Indianapolis has been mocked to drafting Sky Moore at 42nd overall. It is interesting that, I mean, they brought in 4 of the back end wide receivers. I mean, Kalen Barnes, Romeo Doubs, Danny Gray, Velus Jones. I mean, none of those guys have been on my radar, particularly from a dynasty perspective, but at least we do know that the Colts are recognizing wide receiver as an area in need. I mean, anybody with at least the ability to go to any of the sites that provide information on depth charts, you could look at the Colts depth chart and recognize that they need some influx in youth at the position. So it does make some sense that they would wind up taking a look at that. Also interesting, they brought in Malik Willis as well, but I don't think they're going to wind up drafting him now with Matt Ryan firmly in place, but we'll see. But I think that's the big takeaway from me is trying to combine this information here on this chart, which teams are we kind of expecting to see them still in the market for any of the skill positions, and also taking a look at well, where have they allocated a lot of their private workouts? Where have they spent the most time at trying to figure out, well, are these guys and is this position a position of need for us? I mean, Atlanta looking like a spot that a lot of folks have mocked for one of the wide receivers or possibly quarterback. That's where they spent a lot of their time at so far. Private workouts for at least 3 of the top quarterback prospects. Also looking at tight end as well, which is also kind of odd considering, but I'm assuming these guys are mostly, I mean, Deese, if I'm remembering correctly, is more of a blocking tight end than anything else. But I think that's the whole purpose, is trying to combine most of this information so that for the teams that are expected or could be expected in order to draft one of these rookie prospects that we might wind up drafting for our teams, it's also where have the teams also been looking at as well. And the last one that I want to take a look at, because I've heard it mentioned a few times, Chicago. So Chicago, you can see they're 39th overall and 48th overall. And they do have Darnell Mooney. Allen Robinson just shipped over to the Rams. And so it's essentially just Mooney, Byron Pringle, Cole Kmet. I mean, those are your primary pass catchers as of right now. And so the expectation would be that the Bears will wind up using their draft capital in the second round in order to grab a wide receiver. Does that match up with what we know or what's been what is publicly available? Absolutely. I mean, Treylon Burks, Danny Gray, Tyquan Thornton, I mean, wide receivers that have been given private workouts like by Chicago. So it makes sense that Chicago, we all see that wide receiver is an area of need for them. And they've also recognized that, at least from the sense that they're bringing in these wide receivers to see how they could possibly integrate in their offense. Are these prospects worthwhile? And so on and so forth. And with the 3 private workouts too, a guy like Burks, who we know is going to be at the top end, still wouldn't expect to see him. Well, it's entirely possible at, actually, no, I take that back, 39th overall. I'd be somewhat surprised to see him there at 39th overall, but who knows like how the first round is going to play out. But again, that's where having to adjust to what we see from day one, and then afterwards playing the kind of process of elimination game here at the start of day 2. And that's really what I'm looking for, like here in day 2, is what is going to be left over from the first round. Like which wide receivers are going to be left out, which running backs are now going to be on the board in order to which running backs are going to be available, all of them at the beginning of day 2, but which teams are going to have that need there, and being able to utilize something like what is available here at Walter Football and kind of synthesizing this into, well, these teams have already brought in running backs. They have at least acknowledged this as a position of need for them. And that can kind of help you whittle down that information and see, all right, well, this team might actually be the team that selects Breece Hall, Isaiah Spiller, Kenneth Walker, so on and so forth, and any of the wide receivers that we're expecting to be drafted here at the start of day 2. And then the adjustment to that is, again, now we're going to look at which draft capital is going to get assigned to these guys. Now here's where draft capital now starts to play a larger factor, because we're going to have a smaller pool of players that, 1, we're going to be interested in, and 2, are going to be assigned that early second round draft capital that does have a higher hit rate than once we start getting further and further into the draft, so that we do have a sense of, all right, well, now I'm going to at least start to value that draft capital more. I'm going to want to grab any of these wide receivers that might get drafted here, whether it's going to be if Jahan Dotson happens to fall, Christian Watson gets passed up and falls into the second round. Treylon Burks, says his name has popped up quite a few times on the teams that we were taking a look at. If he's the one that gets selected to any one of these teams, of course, landing spot and their situation, offensive situation afterwards, plays a role. But at this point, draft capital, we know that at least correlates to how quickly they can get on the field and how quickly they can wind up getting those reps that we know that they need at the professional level. So, with all that being said, and for the second round, absolutely. That is what I'm going to be looking for, is which one of these guys are going to be left over, and then how quickly we can start to see them snatched up by other teams, because the first round is essentially going to dictate all of that information that we're going to need to give us that this remaining pool of guys that are going to be available for us here in the second round. And once that list starts to, dwindle bit by bit, as teams start to pick them up, as Chicago starts to draft their, the wide receiver or possibly draft their wide receivers, Arizona might go for a running back. We can start to then figure out, all right, well, who's going to be available left, like towards the back end of the second round, and make our adjustments properly. Last round that I want to take a look at, third round. So again, looking at what's going on here in the third round. Not a ton. I mean, from the mocks that I've seen done so far, and just from the available draft capital for the teams there, you can see on this chart. I mean, third round, maybe the Chargers are still looking at something, looking at a wide receiver or any of the skill positions there in the third round. Same thing with Tennessee and Green Bay. I mean, for most of the mocks I've seen so far, and even, that's where most of the information is coming from, or at least that's what we can expect. And even if we, again, hop back over to grinding the mocks, exact same thing. I mean, the expectation is most of those guys are going to be drafted there. It becomes more of a toss-up at that point. So what do we know? We can at least expect that, at least expect those things, or expect those teams to be drafting some of those guys. And for the Chargers, again, let's see if we can combine that information with what we know from what they've done with their visits so far. I'm going to pop on over to Chargers, scroll on down. Let's see. Oh, wait, the Chargers not even on here? Wow, they haven't even brought in any of those guys. That's interesting. That's a new one for me. I thought so far, looking at where a lot of the mocks have had them, that the Chargers would have been interested in drafting a wide receiver, or they would have brought in a wide receiver for a private workout. But at least as of right now, and I think this data was just as of, I think it was Friday or Saturday. I have to double check to confirm. But that is what. But that's an interesting thing to see that so far. I mean, no private workouts like for the Chargers. But that's where, again, always trying to check and see, like, well, what are these teams trying to tell us, like with their private workouts, or even with the guys they're trying to bring in? Because a lot of these mocks, like, they can be brought in by guys that have connections. I mean, from the Dane Bruglers, Daniel Jeremiah's, all of those guys. I mean, they have their connections, but teams have to, like, they can't lie with a lot of the, like, these private workouts, and especially once we get to draft day. So if they're at least giving off that type of information to us, we should be able to act accordingly. And with the Chargers not really doing that, that is an interesting thing to see as of right now. I wasn't actually expecting that. And then a couple other teams to take a look at. I mean, Tennessee, we already looked at Green Bay earlier. Let's go ahead and see if Tennessee has taken a look at, like, any of these wide receivers. Pop back over to a spreadsheet. Let's see. I'm not entirely certain, to be honest. So this could be another good test. Like, actually, yeah. So they have brought in, Calvin Austin, Treylon Burks, and Sky Moore. So at least two or all three guys that are at the very least like day two picks. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, Sky Moore being more, I guess, being rumored to slide into like the first round. So it's interesting that they've done that. But now I don't think, there's absolutely no way, at least in my mind, that they're going to be available here on day three, or not day three, but in the third round or at the end of day two, that's going to be possible. But I think the point of it all is that recognizing wide receiver as a position of need, we've definitely seen that. And also, like, where their other visits have been, skill position, tight end, and then wide receiver. Very, very interesting. Like that's been, like, it's their focus, like, so far, like throughout the draft process. But so that's going to do it here for me today, folks. You've kind of seen me walk through first, second, third round, mapped out kind of where we're expecting some of these guys to go, or what we're expecting from each of these rounds in general, and then how we can kind of use some of the information that the teams have provided in order to say, all right, well, this is where we're expecting some of these players to go. And depending on where they go, this group of players here, whether it be the 6 or 7 wide receivers that are drafted in the first round, all right, let's say they do get drafted there. How do we adjust? Are we going to use draft capital as the benchmark for saying that these guys should be drafted ahead of them or not? Or are we going to let landing spot and then their path to production kind of dictate how we value them? For the first round, I'm going with the latter rather than the former, but we'll see how things shake out, like after Thursday night. And then for the second round, for second and third round, that is where draft capital, at least for me, let's start to take over a bit more. And you can see where draft capital now starts to play a larger role, because we do have, at least for wide receiver, especially less players available, at least less players of note available in order to pick up that production early. For running backs, it's different since we only have 2 to 3 prospects that we're interested in anyway, whether it's Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Isaiah Spiller, possibly. I mean, past that, I mean, I'm interested in guys like Brian Robinson, but we'll see how much the NFL is going to be interested in guys like that. I can see them slipping well into day 3 before we see guys like that getting drafted, but I'm hoping that they get higher draft capital. But for all this and more, I mean, definitely stop by footballguys.com, check out the content, see what else we've got going on. Like I mentioned earlier, I mean, our director for Dynasty content at Jeff Bell, he's got a short video up on YouTube about Malik Willis. Was also able to put together, and you can see this in Joe Bryant's latest newsletter, or actually his newsletter from a couple of days ago about his first round mock draft. But all that and more, I mean, as you'll see over the next few days from the Dynasty content that we're providing here at Football Guys, myself, Adam Wilde, Sig Bloom, Matt Waldman, Cecil Lammy, all of us will be here for you over the next week as we figure out like how this draft is going to go. So I'm ready for the fireworks. I really am. But until then, appreciate y'all checking us out. Be safe, and I'll catch y'all later. Peace.